Hi, welcome to Really Random Reads. My name is Andy. Today, a video on where to start with Herman Melville. And the answer to that is there are lots of possible starting places, and I'm not doing this video to say this is the only way you can start with Melville or anything like that. If you don't follow this suggestion, then you're never going to enjoy his writing. I'm making it because I think Melville is one of those authors that can scare people away, and okay, so let's talk about that. I have a friend of my partner really, who is incredibly clever, sharp guy. I'm not just being falsely modest here, this is genuinely the truth, just objectively. He is much cleverer than me, extremely sharp. And he started to read Moby Dick and gave up very quickly. He said he couldn't get past all this information that the author was giving him about whales that didn't actually seem to be part of the story. That's another video, we can talk about that another time. But I kind of get it. I don't agree, but I get it. And where you meet an author for the first time, I think is quite important. Had I met Melville just by picking up Moby Dick, I'm not sure I would have had that experience that admittedly many people have, of immediately falling in love with that book. I think I would have needed to have found another way in. I want to say I'm aware, but I'm not really. I just think this because of an episode of The Sopranos, the TV show where they talk about it. I think that in schools in America, it's not uncommon for people to read Billy Budd the Sailor and study it. To the best of my knowledge, that isn't the case in England. I don't think we really do Herman Melville in school. Where am I going with this, folks? Billy Budd the Sailor. If we did, I don't think that would have been a brilliant way for me to find my way into Melville, because I read it after having read Bartleby, kind of expecting and perhaps hoping for more of the same. And Billy Budd the Sailor is quite different. And whereas my experience with Bartleby was like, boom, I'm immediately engaged. I want to get to the end of this. It's a page turner. I'm completely invested and I want to find out what's happening. I wasn't lost in Billy Budd the Sailor. I was more consciously navigating it. No pun intended. It's about a ship. I think the reason for that largely, and the same with Moby Dick. I enjoy Moby Dick, but in a sense it's also, I'm tempted to use the word work. Like I'm working through that book, it feels like, even though I'm enjoying it. A lot of it, I think, is because of the sentence structure. So Melville is writing in the 1800s, and sometimes you'll read one of his sentences and it might run on for almost a paragraph. You've got multiple clauses in there. The syntax, the sentence structure, very complicated. There'll be a joke in it, but it takes a minute for the joke to even dawn on you because of how it's written. Things like, I didn't get that experience at all when I read Bartleby the Scrivener, which my dog Pickle, when we first had her, she helped herself to this book and ate half of the cover. This story is quite gothic and uncanny and a bit creepy, and with this addition to the cover, I feel that kind of was added to it for me. Why was this such a good way in? Because he's not suddenly writing as a minimalist, with very sort of like simple sentence structures and stuff in this. Partly perhaps it's the length, okay, so it's about 60 pages, but Billy Budd the Sailor is also a short story, and that wasn't an immediate way into Melville's writing for me. A big part of it was the humour, and it's difficult to try to explain humour, because if I say I found something funny, and then I try to tell you why I found it funny, I'm trying to explain a joke, and often that kind of doesn't really work very well. But when I've watched other YouTube videos about this book, I've realised I'm not alone in having found it funny. So humour was a big way in for me. Another part of the reason I found this so interesting, or so engaging, that's a better word, was because of the surrealism of it. And I'm not normally a surrealist type of person, but when I read it, it didn't feel like it fitted in 1853. It felt like much more, I don't know, David Lynch, or maybe, actually, Roald Dahl short stories, where they have a lot of the absurd and the macabre about them. There's also, and I'm not the first person to point this out, you can also feel a lot of sort of Kafka in this. And it felt fresh and modern in a way that, parts of Notes from Underground by Dostoevsky, large parts, felt for me, large sections when I read that book. Something about the modern workplace, it can, this is really clear with the ending, it can dehumanize you, I feel, particularly these kind of sort of office jobs. So it has this modernist kind of freshness to it too. I've avoided telling you what it's actually about. Let me give you a bit of an introduction to it. So it's about a person who gets a job as a scrivener, a clerk, somebody who copies out text in an office. And he seems like the ideal employee at first. And it's set up, as another book Juper has pointed out, it's set up as a horror story almost. And it continues, in my view, as a kind of surrealist horror story. So it's set up, in horror, when at first something just seems too good to be true, he seems like too much the ideal employee, and then it takes a turn. It's probably most famous for this phrase, which found its way into culture, of "I would prefer not to." And when I first encountered this story, it was actually through an audiobook, and I've tried really hard to find it. It was a LibriVox, but when I looked up LibriVox, it's not the same voice. The voice that I heard when I first encountered this story matched it so perfectly, and I can still hear it now in my mind when I think of that famous phrase, "I would prefer not to." I then physically read it, several years later and enjoyed it just as much. And it is one of those that I think I'm going to keep going back to. And when I look back through my reading diary, which I keep like in hard copy, that was pretty much what I wrote. Enjoyed it as much as the first time, still very much stands up. I was looking back through, there was a place I worked and it was brilliant for doing managerial training and teaching you how to be a really good manager. There was a place I work where I kept the handouts from one of those training sessions like you learned on the job board, so those training sessions. And on the handout, and I wouldn't have appreciated it at the time because it was before I read this, there's a picture of a tall, gaunt man and a caption saying, "I would prefer not to." That's the speech bubble. And when you got into that training, one of the things it talked about was how to manage people if you were line managing them, who were maybe challenging in this kind of very passive kind of way, where they wouldn't overtly say or not do something, they would say, "I would prefer not to do it." So it does, in that sense, it still has modern relevance, and even more so, I think, why it still has modern relevance, because it deals so well with this theme of conflict and power. So if you've got somebody going through a story just saying, "I would prefer not to," on the one hand, you could say, okay, well, that's a literary device. And I think you deprive yourself of a lot if you just read it that way. It feels deeper than that. And he does, to me, he's not the protagonist, but the character of Bartleby, he doesn't feel like a two-dimensional character to me. I leave the story wanting to know much, much more about him and still regularly think of him afterwards. And that's usually an indicator for me of whether a character feels real. Where if you looked at it as a device, it does work particularly well, is it brings out the theme of power. So who would have the power in this situation, you'd be thinking? The setup is Bartleby has a new job. You would be thinking his boss has the power in this situation. But in fact, Melville spins it on his head. And as it goes through, and this is one of the key reasons why I think this is a good book to start with Melville, he handles escalation brilliantly. There isn't a wasted page in this book or a wasted scene, and there isn't a scene where he doesn't, in a very authentic and organic way, escalate on the tension that's come before. And the tension, the conflict, comes from the characters. So I've heard it said that the best fiction, it tends to, or it usually deals with, in some way, some sort of theme of power. And what particularly engages a reader is if you can feel a character being wronged. And you feel that for different characters in this book. You feel it both for the protagonist, but you also feel it for Bartleby, who at times, the protagonist is the boss, appears to be the boss's antagonist. In building on this, what Melville does is he also brings out, these feel like rounded characters to me. He brings out the sadistic tendencies that can come through in the person that we might see as a victim or being victimized. He also is really good at showing how the universal thing of how we might, I think everybody does at least at some point, try to avoid conflict. So, and drama is conflict, right? You might disagree with that, you might say, oh, that's a hackneyed old saying, but there is that school of thought that drama is conflict, and for what it's worth is one that I agree with. When the protagonist, the boss, is confronted at different points in this story with conflict, sometimes his approach is to try and pretend it isn't happening, to avoid it. That's universal, I think. I think everybody, at least in some point in their lives, can relate with that, and that is to that, and that is why when I sort of read this story from 1853, I can very much see things in it that I relate with. These themes of power, of trying to avoid conflict, of feeling overwhelmed by a problem, by a conflict, by a challenge, and not knowing how to go about tackling it. For all these reasons, this book clicked in with me. And over the course of these 60 very tightly written pages, where conflict is at all times escalating, where each scene is building upon the last scene, where there aren't these what appear as tangents, say in Moby Dick, you're not getting that in Melville. And you come away thinking, I've met a writer who's held my engagement throughout the story, who's made me feel this book that was written in 1853 is still fresh and relevant today, who left me wanting to know more about these characters, left me wanting to go away and read other things written by this writer who to some extent I now trust, I've developed a relationship with. You hopefully come away with those types of feelings, rather than if you pick up some of Melville's other stories where, for me, the magic is still there, but I have to kind of work to find my way in. I don't think you have to work as much with Herman Melville. Now, granted, I didn't read this on the page the first time I encountered it. The first time I encountered it, I listened to it on an audiobook. Did that help me? Perhaps, but I really don't think so, because I went back to this story after several years and read it, literally read it, and seemed, to the best of my recollection, it clicked just the same, it worked just the same. So if you're going to read Melville, this might be a way in. If you abandon Moby Dick or Billy Budd the Sailor or any of his other stories, maybe Melville is worth revisiting. And if you think he is, maybe this is one of the ways that you might choose to do that. If you liked this video, feel free to click the thumbs up and give it a like. If you want to see more of this type of stuff, click the subscribe button, and that's free, by the way. I saw question on another channel the other day where somebody was asking, do you have to pay to subscribe? And I suppose often when we use that word subscription, it is usually accompanied by some kind of charge, isn't it? But if for some reason you're wondering that, no, you don't. Cool. Thanks, folks. Bye.